It's
Oh, we are good.
there we go.
Thank you. So it's nice to be here and run a committee meeting by myself for the first time. So I'm very excited. So we'll go ahead and, as Carrie said, start the roll call of committee members first, and then any other ACUS members in attendance. So I'll start with Carrie.
I'm here.
Great. And James Anderson. Okay, no James. Gary Bass. Emily Bremer. Emily emailed and said she was going to be a little late today. Ilona Cohen. Peter Constantine. Stephen Crowley. Curdy Dotla. Elizabeth Dickinson. Neil Eisner. Andrew Emery.
Yep, here.
Thank you, Andrew. Cynthia Farina. Michael Hertz. Richard Hippolyte. Sally Katzen. Katja Krutel. I know some of these people are RSVP'd, so they might just be joining late. Debbie Murphy.
Here.
Thank you. Debbie is an alternate for Daniel Liebman. Hillary Malauer. Jerry Mashaw.
Present.
Thank you. Randolph May. Nina Mendelson. Elena Ness.
Here's what I did.
Hi, I'm here. Good morning.
Hi, thank you. Did I say your name right?
You did, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Elena's a alternate for Rebecca Orban. Nicholas Pirillo.
Yes, here, Pirillo.
Pirillo. Thank you. Dick Pierce.
Here.
Thank you. Mitchell Plav. David Pritzker.
I'm here.
Thank you. Teresa Roseborough. Virtual Ross.
I'm here.
Thank you. Noel Green. Not yet. Lon Smith.
I'm here.
Thank you. Kevin Stack.
Here.
Robert Stone. Thomas Sussman. Miriam Vincent.
Here.
Thank you. And Adam White. Is there anybody who's on the committee of rulemaking who did not hear their name? Okay. I'm going to proceed with the ACUS members that I see. I also just want to note that Bridget Dooling is an ACUS member, but for the purposes of this project, she is only participating as the project consultant. So Bridget Dooling?
I'm here.
Perfect. And then Rachel Potter.
Here.
She is our other consultant on this project, and she is not an ACUS member. Steph Tatham.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, thank you. Jim Tozy.
Present.
Thank you. Are there any other ACUS members that are here whose name I did not call?
Hi, this is Noelle Green. I just joined. I'm standing in for Helen Serasio at EPA.
Perfect. Thank you, Noelle. I have you down.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Any other names I have not called of ACUS members or committee members? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Carrie.
Great. Well, thank you. Let me officially welcome everyone to our meeting today. This is the first meeting of the Rulemaking Committee to consider the recommendation on contractors' role in the rulemaking process. Before we get underway, I'd like to ask if Matt Weiner would like to offer any opening remarks.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Kaja. Only to welcome everyone to this. I guess this is the inaugural meeting of our spring committee season. Thanks to all the members in attendance today, and thanks to you, Carrie, for chairing the meeting of this project. The meetings for this project. I hope and trust that this one, these proceedings will be a little bit easier for you than the meetings for the last project you chaired on mass comments, though certainly no less important. And thanks finally to our two distinguished consultants, Bridget Dooling and Rachel Potter, for providing us with an excellent report. I have no doubt that it will serve the committee very well as it deliberates on this recommendation. With that, Carrie, I have nothing further and turn it back to you to have a good meeting.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matt. And let me also add my thanks to our two consultants, Rachel and Bridget, who we'll hear from in a moment to share an overview of their research. But at the outset, we have, as is customary at the beginning of these committee meetings, a bit of administrative announcements, just to review the standard meeting protocols that we'll use as a basis for our deliberations today. Only ACUS members, and that includes people who are on the committee or not on the committee, but ACUS members or their designated alternates have the full speaking privileges. That said, when you're not speaking, it's advisable if you could mute your microphone so that we don't get background noise. If you want to be recognized to speak, use your Zoom hand raise function, or if that's not working for you, you can't find it, you can also put a comment in the chat indicating that you'd like to speak, and I will keep a queue and we'll call on committee members and ACUS members as best I can in the order that you come in. And then you can unmute yourself and remute yourself when you're finished. On the chat function, this is true for all participants in today's meeting. Please use that only to indicate that you'd like to speak, or if it's if we should ever get to a vote, but it won't happen, I'm sure, today. Don't have the sidebar conversations or substantive comments in the chat. Let's keep that accessible to all through our dialogue. I do encourage ACUS members or their alternates to use their webcam and keep that on to facilitate our interaction. We do have others here, I think, today who are not ACUS members or their alternates. The general rules that they can participate with the unanimous consent of the committee members. And my customary practice is to try to fit in as much of their input as time allows. And I'll presume that there is unanimous consent at those appropriate points in time, unless someone raises an objection. So if anyone who is here who's not an ACUS member would like to participate, you can also use the Zoom hand raise function or the chat to indicate that you would like to speak. Again, as with everyone else, please keep your mute button turned on. When we do get to voting, which again, I'm not expecting will happen today, but when we do get to that, only members of the rulemaking committee will have that vote. With that, unless there's any questions that anybody has about those standard protocols, I'd like to turn things over to our two consultants, Bridget Dooling and Rachel Potter, to give us a short overview of their excellent report, the research underlying it, and kind of recommendations that they put forward to the committee for our consideration and for the staff to develop with the draft recommendations that we will afterwards turn to. I should say the obvious, you see that the draft recommendation doesn't have a complete preamble, just some notes and sketches toward that. So today's discussion, I think, will be moving forward toward what will probably be a second committee meeting then to finalize the recommendations once we have had a chance to deliberate today, and also see the benefit of a fully fleshed out draft preamble. There is a possibility, of course, if it should be needed, for an additional meeting after that, but I think at a minimum we'll have today and then one other meeting on April 12th to take up this undertaking. So with that, let me turn it over to Rachel and Bridget and let you share the findings from your research.
Sounds good. So I'll kick us off, and while Kaja gets this slides up, I'll just express some gratitude to the Administrative Conference for incubating this project as an Office of the Chairman project and trusting us to try some new methods, including a survey of contacts listed on agency regulatory agendas. And in particular, we really appreciate Matt, Reeve, and Jeremy's leadership, as well as excellent support from the attorney advisors along the way. We've had a few. We started with Mark Thompson, who's now moved on to private practice, Danny Shulkin, who's off doing fabulous things in the White House, and now Kaja, who, as you can see, is a true asset to ACUS. So you could think that working with Rachel and I is the last straw that forces these folks to leave, but I prefer to think this is a sign that working with us is a ticket to fame and fortune beyond ACUS's walls. Also really humbled to present to this committee, in particular, given the depth of expertise from colleagues around this virtual table. Also, just to note at the top, this is a draft report. So if you're aware of literature that we should be citing in particular, maybe even some of your own, please do let us know. We look forward to learning from you as we go through these meetings and through the ACUS process in general. Okay, so let me just kick us off with what is this project about? So next slide, please, Kaja. Much has been written about government contractors. We are not the first to look into this space, not nearly. When we particularly hear about it, it sort of punches through the news cycle on the heels of some sort of scandal. So, particularly in the military context are the more recent scandals that come to mind. Some of the writing that has taken place, particularly in the academic context, suggests that contractors may be taking over the rulemaking process, but support for that claim had been limited. So ours is the first project to do a deep dive on the use of contractors in rulemaking. And by that, we mean distinct from other regulatory activities like enforcement, for example. We're really focused on the rulemaking process itself. So the big question of the report, do agencies use contractors in the rulemaking process? If so, how and why? And what can we learn in a first pass, a highly qualitative pass, focused mostly on interviews? What can we learn about these arrangements? Now, our methods, which I'll discuss in a moment, are highly qualitative. And this therefore is going to limit our ability to make sweeping statements. But again, think of this as a first pass and uncovering agency behaviors and contractor behaviors and sort of situating us into this landscape of this general topic. Next slide, please. Okay, so from a methods perspective, how did we evaluate contractor use in rulemaking? Well, like two good academics, we started with a survey of the academic literature on governmental contracting, basically finding very little on the use of rulemaking in particular. Most of the writing has just been focused on other domains of government activities. So we constructed a method that involved interviews. We started with semi-structured interviews with experts and oversight officials, 12 in total. And this was a group of folks from GAO, from GSA, from OMB, as well as academic experts who've written on these topics before. So in total, 4 4 experts and 8 oversight officials. So 4 academics basically, and 8 oversight folks. Then we moved on to semi-structured interviews with agency officials and contractors. We did 33 of those. We contacted ACUS representatives and followed a chain referral approach, basically asking, is there anyone else we should talk to about these topics in your agency? That led to 27 agency personnel, both current and former. We did speak with some retirees, for example, and folks who had otherwise separated from the government, as well as 6 contractors, which came to us through this chain referral approach, with agency folks saying, who you should really talk to is, this contractor over here. We also introduced what we believe is a novel method into the ACUS report, which is a survey of rulemaking personnel. We selected 324 contacts from completed rulemakings from a recent unified agenda. And then we contacted those individual contacts. On the agenda entry itself, there is a listing for a particular contact at an agency associated for each rule. So we contacted those folks in order to survey them about contractor use on the particular rule for which they were listed as the point of contact for the agency. We got 51 responses, of which 38 were complete. So that's about a 12.5% response rate for completes, which is not too shabby if you're familiar with the challenges of modern survey administration. So we're actually quite pleased with that. And we're just very grateful to everyone who participated in this research, for their knowledge, of course, but also for their candor, which you can see in the types of interview quotes that we were able to assemble in the course of this research. Really appreciate that candor, particularly given that this can be a pretty tricky topic. We did go through IRB approval, part of which was about not only offering, but following through on promises of confidentiality, which is why we don't pinpoint particular agencies in the report unless we can document something using public sources. So you'll notice it just says, interview X, interview 1, interview 4, for example. That's obviously intentional and related to the promises that we gave our respondents when we interviewed them. Next slide, please. Okay, so the big event. What do contractors do in rulemaking? Let's talk about the tasks. From the first point I would mention is that it really depends on who you ask. Some reported that contractors don't get involved at all. And I've got a couple of quotes here. One, the default was, we don't use a contractor. That was from one retired agency employee. The next said that the use of a contractor would be highly irregular. Okay, so that's one category of respondents who are saying, basically we don't use contractors in rulemaking. The next group of folks would say contractors are integral to rulemaking. Contractors are basically staff augmentation. They're us, they're feds, but in italics. These are wildly different perspectives on the proper role of contractors in rulemaking. So overall, our research reveals that contractors do perform a diverse set of rulemaking tasks, from the ministerial to those closely tied to policymaking, which is what we'll get into next. But that first point about the sort of attitudes and perspectives about the role of contractors is something that I think is really helpful context as you think about recommendations coming out of this committee. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an overwhelming table, I will admit, but this is borrowed from the report. It's organizing the tasks into rulemaking stages, because it became clear to us that there were certain things that really mapped really nicely onto the APA notice and comment rulemaking process. And so we thought we would array tasks in that way. So you have the detail in the report. I think I'll probably leave it at that, just to say the types of tasks can sometimes be sorted into rulemaking stage. On the front end, that might involve conducting research, running models, helping with planning, figuring out timelines, as well as weighing in on strategies for how to get through a regulatory project. Once you're into the proposed stage, now we see contractors potentially drafting and editing internal materials like decision memos or other sort of written materials that are moving their way through the agency. The contractors might help draft the proposed rule. They could write the first draft, including the preamble and reg text. They could review drafts that were first drafted by agency staff. They could also help with something more ministerial, like formatting the document, making sure that it conforms to governmental agency templates, for example. They might also provide data or other analytical support for the analytical pieces that swim alongside that rule. So the regulatory impact analysis, Paperwork Reduction Act materials, etc. They might also help the agency staff understand and reconcile feedback received from within the agency. So perhaps the agency's lawyers or other folks within the executive branch. That could include other agencies that have equities in the regulatory matter, as well as comments coming back from OMB and EOP under the EO 12866 review process for rules. In the comment stage, this is probably what folks thought contractors were doing, if they thought contractors were doing anything at all in rulemaking. This is helping to manage the comments themselves, both keeping an eye on the comments as they roll in through the comment process, and then processing those comments in various ways, everything from simply downloading them and organizing them to actually getting in there, categorizing them, summarizing them, and then helping to draft responses to those comments, which would ultimately go in the preamble of the agency's final rule. In the final rule stage, you see all the same tasks as those in the proposed stage, plus a few more, things like developing fact sheets, guidance documents, rollout materials, taking the rule to Congress under the Congressional Review Act. Contractors do that too. So you can start to see the range of activities here, right? It's everything from, courier services, basically taking a rule package to Congress because it has to be delivered in person, all the way up to actually helping to draft, the preamble and reg text. And then of course, two more here, supporting implementation and providing litigation support downstream. So we didn't spend a lot of time asking our interviewees about things that happen beyond the final rule stage, but this is just the things that they offered in the course of our talking about the things that contractors were doing. And I'm going to hand it over to Rachel to take us home.
Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. And I want to start by just echoing Bridget's thanks. So we've been so fortunate to have ACUS's support and the support of all the people that participated in this project and your feedback today, which we're really looking forward to. Looking at this slide, what we've done here is noted that the tasks that Bridget just went through, they don't all tie to specific stages of the rulemaking process. So that was an interesting thing we learned from our respondents, is that sometimes contractors are sort of along for many rules or many parts of the process. And a good example of this is data support. So you see that on the left part of the screen. Sometimes agencies will get data support from a contractor that will span multiple rules or span the entire course of one rulemaking. So that's an example of the kind of task we found that spanned the course of the rulemaking. We also noted that occasionally what we heard from people was that contractors really were doing specific one-off tasks, like special projects. And so we wanted to give you some flavor of that too. Here what we saw was that, for example, a prototypical example might be a contractor coming in and helping an agency rewrite their RIA guidance, just because they didn't have the staff to do it themselves at that point in time, but it needed to get done. So I won't go through all of these in the interest of time. They are in the report as a separate table. I believe it's table 3. Can I have the next slide, Kaja? Okay, so stepping back, what have we learned through this exercise, all of these interviews and surveys? Well, I really want to reiterate a point that Bridget made already, which is that coming into this, we didn't have a good sense of how much contractors were doing in rulemaking. Our research design really doesn't allow us to give prevalence estimates or even to tell you the number of contractors or what they're doing, but we can say that there's really a lot of variation. So again, highlighting this point that at some agencies, there's just really an aversion almost to using contractors, and they really don't use them very often or maybe even never in rulemaking, to agencies where they're a regular part of the team and they express sentiments along the lines of, how could we possibly do our rules if we didn't have our contractors? So there's really just a gamut of use of contractors and their prevalence. I don't want to use the word prevalence, but their integration into the rulemaking workflow. Unsurprisingly, as Bridget mentioned, this is associated with a really divergent perspectives on both the appropriateness and the benefits and risks of having contractors at the rulemaking table. There's not one party line in the US federal government about what contractors mean for rulemaking. There's really, and we dive into this a lot in the report, but just a real rich variation here. In the agencies that we interacted with, we did not encounter a single use of a written policy on contractors and rulemaking. And we are happy to talk more about, and I'm sure we will talk more about what a policy for contractors in rulemaking might look like. But it might talk about what meetings contractors are allowed to come to, what they're not allowed to come to, how agency personnel should oversee and manage it, what kinds of external disclosure. But we didn't encounter any of that in the interactions we had. We did, however, find that there is a widespread awareness that there is an inherently governmental function line. Our respondents were not always able to use the term of art IGF, but they did know that there are things pretty universally, they did know there are things contractors should not be doing. They couldn't always articulate that line very well. And it wasn't necessarily the same across agencies or even within the same agency. One respondent put this sort of a sentiment in a way I thought was really useful, saying contractors can do everything except push the big red policy making button. Next slide, please. Partly because of sort of the way the rulemaking is structured at many agencies, there wasn't a lot of ability across programs to know what is happening in terms of contractors and rulemaking. So you might have an agency with two programs that both write rules. Both of them might be using contractors, and there isn't necessarily a mechanism by which program A could know that program B has a contractor working on managing comments, for example. And often we encountered situations where we knew things that the person surveying or that we were interviewing did not know about their contracts for rulemaking in their own agency. Similarly, we also noted that sometimes it wasn't just a vertical inability to know what was happening, or sorry, horizontal, but there was also vertical, a sort of siloing of this where the program officials might know, but their leadership might not have good access to understanding who was doing what, and what by who I mean contractors versus agency personnel. It's unsurprising then to learn that the public doesn't have a good read on what contractors are doing in rulemaking, what the tasks are. This idea of external transparency that we talk about in the report is pretty limited. It's hard to know from the outside, both given public procurement data systems and their disclosure about rulemaking, as well as sort of the state of policies and agencies about what they disclose. So there's not a lot of external transparency. Both of these things together suggest to us that there might be potentials for conflict of interest both at the organizational and the personal level, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. Another thing we encountered in our conversations was that agencies don't just rely on contractors when they need extra help. There's lots of other ways that they expand their own capacity. Could I have the next slide, please? I will not go through all of this in the interest of time, but we do go in the report in detail on each of these different strategies that agencies can use to get help when they need it to expand their capacity. And the final slide, please, Kaja. So we make 6 recommendations in the report, or we propose 6 recommendations. The first is that agencies should take stock of what's happening within their own agency about contractors and rulemaking. Before proceeding, they kind of need to know what the lay of the land is for their agency, because it's not the same across agencies. Once they've done that, we encourage them to consider the range of options as I've laid out on the previous slide, that are available to them beyond using contractors. Not all of the things that are on that slide are available at every agency at all points in time. So they need to develop a plan for what they would do when and what's available to them. We're also proposing that agencies develop written policies, again, along the dimensions that I already mentioned, about how contractors should operate in rulemaking? What tasks should they be doing? What tasks should they not be doing, among other things? Fourth, we encourage agencies to think about internal and external transparency, very cognizant of the cost of increasing transparency to agencies, but that these are important components that should be considered, and those are both within and outside of the agency. Fifth, we encourage agencies, or OMB, excuse me, to consider additional clarification and guidance surrounding rulemaking and closely associated with inherently governmental functions in rulemaking, and whether this additional guidance could help agencies to arbitrate that line or navigate that line more easily. And finally, in closing, we note that our report is really a descriptive enterprise. We aimed to kind of understand the lay of the land as it currently is with respect to contractors and rulemaking. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about that. We found ourselves asking a lot of questions that we weren't able to answer in this report. And so we see this as opening the door to more research and additional questions that we think need answering, and we lay out 5 of those in the report. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel and Bridget. Let me offer a short amount of time here. If anyone on the committee or any ACUS member has any questions for Bridget and Rachel. That was a very thorough presentation of what is all itself a very comprehensive and clear report. So, but there may be some questions from ACUS members, and I see Stephanie, you have your hand up, so ask away.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Professor Potter, Professor Dooling, this was truly an excellent report, and I very much enjoyed reading it. I had a question for you. I was just curious about the distribution of the agencies who use contractors. It sounded like there are some who don't use them at all, and then there are others who use them extensively. Do you have a sense of how many agencies fall into those buckets, and if there's any correlation between how frequently they engage in rulemaking or how many rules they promulgate over the course of a year?
I can answer that, Bridget, and then if you want to pipe in. Unfortunately, we can't really answer that question. And this is a question we've already heard from several people who have given us feedback on the report. Tell us how much of this is happening and what does it correlate with? Our research design really doesn't allow us to answer that in a good way. And so we are really trying to be responsible in how we answer that. There is variation, we can say that, we're also limited by the ability to identify individual agencies, because we did encounter ones that we would, I think Bridget and I, between the two of us, would put in those buckets, but we can't really say which ones they are. Bridget, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's right. It's if that's unsatisfying, it's unsatisfying to us as well.
One thing, if just a follow up quickly on that, Rachel and Bridget, it wasn't evident to me in the report nor in your presentation exactly how many agencies in total then were included in your interviews and how many were included in the surveys. You give us the number of respondents, but I imagine you might have had more than one respondent from the same agency. Just in a way, I mean, in a way of just gauging even how comprehensive across the range of agencies. Do you have a number for how many you included in your survey and in your interviews?
I don't off the top of my head, but we can pull that and get it back to you.
Okay. I have Nick Pirillo next on the queue.
Thanks. I mean, I want to start by saying that I have been interested in the role of contractors in rulemakings for 20 years, ever since I first heard about it from Don Elliott, based on his 2-year stint at the EPA, and I have over and over again tried to learn more about it, either from official public documentation or from scholarship. And it has always been extraordinarily difficult to find out anything. And so this study is just a huge advance on something that so many of us have been aware of as a matter of lore or as a matter of scattered anecdote, and to have, I mean, notwithstanding all the limitations about which you're very candid, I mean, to have this concerted of a research endeavor on this subject is just so valuable, and it's also it's very judiciously put together and well analyzed. So this is just a real service to the field. I mean, in terms of any suggestion I have on the report, or relatedly on the recommendation, it really is to press further on what Stephanie Tatham and Carrie have already said. I mean, I gather that I mean, my understanding was that you're looking at 6 agencies through the interviews. That was how I read the methodology section, that you ended up you ended up getting to talk to people from about half a dozen or something. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that sounds in the ballpark, but I'll pull it now. Sorry.
Sure, but
I was pulling it. It's 6.
So then if you've got these 6 agencies, I mean, just kind of going further from Stephanie's question about correlations and that kind of thing. I mean, I get that we're at the stage of observation. We're not at the stage of formally formulating hypotheses or testing them in a quantitative way or something like that. But I mean, just at this stage of observation, it can really be valuable if you have, just, a few agencies, and it's possible to make a prima facie case that, you have all this variation, you have more use of contractors at some places than others. And does that, seem on a first cut to have any relationship to other larger characteristics on which we know agencies vary? For example, what kind of body of specialized knowledge is adjacent to the agency's mission, or something like that? I mean, are these agencies that deal a lot, with the hard sciences, and others that don't? Other things would be, the volume of rulemaking at the agency, or the volume of OMB significant rules at the agency. The degree to which the agency is adversarial with its industry or faces a lot of litigation risk. Are contractors writing preambles that are for the consumption of courts or not for the consumption of courts, for example? Now, I recognize that part of the reason you were able to get all this excellent qualitative information is that you made this bargain with the interviewees, whereby you would give them these assurances of confidentiality. And obviously you're constrained by that, and you're constrained by the IRB rules and that kind of thing. Nonetheless, you are already in the report giving some, quite interesting, relevant information about the agencies here and there that I don't think runs afoul of any of those constraints. You say at one point regarding one of your interviewees that they're at an agency that has a very low volume of OMB significant rulemakings, for example. So I guess all I'm saying is I'm sure that both of you have insights or the beginnings of hypotheses about correlations between agency contractor usage on the one hand and other characteristics of the agency as you've observed on the other hand. And I urge you to provide and disclose as much of that insight as you feel you can, consistent with the confidentiality assurances that you've given, because I know from experience that when you've made confidentiality assurances, you're naturally very cautious about them. And I guess, along with Stephanie, I just want to say, there really is a kind of a countervailing value on the other side. So, I mean, the more you can kind of interrogate that and, tell us a little bit more without,
Sure.
going so far to identify, that's really valuable.
Excellent. Yeah. And let me just say that, one of the values of having Bridget and Rachel present is if any member of the committee feels like there might be need for some clarification along those lines, that's the time to certainly avail yourselves. We've got 4 more hands up on questions and comments on the report. Let's try to move along as swiftly and efficiently as we can. Bertrell?
Yes, thanks, Carrie. I'll try to be very concise. I'll just ditto Nick's praise for the report. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Rachel. I guess my questions have to do with the contractors themselves and whether there's more to be gleaned. For example, I kept wondering as I was reading the report, and I forget, and I apologize if this is included in the report in ways I overlooked it, whether the contractors were typically long-term contractors or short-term contractors. Were they typically working on rules from beginning to end, multiple rules at a time? I know you mentioned that there were special project contractors. And I know this is not a prevalent study, but I'm curious as to in terms of thinking about the contrast between special projects and short-term contractors and long-term contractors, just thinking about what that might mean. And then repeat player contractors. Now, again, I know you're not assessing prevalence, but I'm curious about how large the universe of contractors is and whether use of a narrow set of contractors might introduce certain biases in data collection and other approaches, for example, and any other discretion-laden decision that contractors might make in doing their jobs and or doing whatever they're contracted to do. So those were kind of curiosities that rose in my mind as I was reading the report.
And Rachel, do you want to take this question? You have a separate piece in the Brookings issue that does actually share some information about the frequency of different contractors.
Yes. So the short and dirty answer to your question is we observed all of those types. So the people that had been around for 5 years and really knew as much, it seemed like, about rulemaking at that agency as the agency personnel, and others who were like one-off and then never heard from again. It is, I don't mean to be putting off the question. The prevalence issue is extraordinarily hard to answer, not just with our research design, but the piece that Carrie mentioned that I wrote for Brookings looks at some procurement data that is specifically targeted to cost benefit analysis and regulatory analysis, which are 2 functions that are identified and are not everything in rulemaking. And even then, I can tell that those data are limited. And I really try to make that clear in the post, but we just don't know. The system doesn't allow us to answer that, the procurement system, the way we went about this. And I think it really highlights how important it is for us to get this first pass of descriptive stuff down, because I worry about exactly what you mentioned, Bertrell, about bias and sort of interviewing the same people who are talking all about the same contractor or set of contractors, right? And so that's really one thing that has given Bridget and I a lot of pause about making these broader claims, is we don't know how much we're tapping into the same things or missing a whole segments of contractors. But I appreciate the point.
Excellent. Thank you.
May I make a follow-up as well?
Bridget, yeah.
Briefly. So thank you both, Bertrell and Nick, for your comments. Really appreciate them. And on the lack of a prevalence estimate in the report, I think does not necessarily need to hold the committee back from thinking about things along the exact lines that you're thinking about them, like what risks might present themselves in long-term versus short-term, special project versus like ongoing staff support. I think we can conceptualize those, even if we can't tell you that it's 85-15, right? So just to say, we have similar instincts, and I think the lack of descriptive, data points on that doesn't mean that we can't like hypothesize, what we might do in different scenarios.
Matt, you're next.
I have a follow-up question. I think you think you may have answered it in part in response to Bertrell's question. Here's my question generally. Is there sort of a definition of contractor? Is there a working definition of contractor? In particular, what I have in mind is the federal government has many employees, and they're often thought of as employees who are actually not employed by the federal government. They're functionally indistinguishable in many ways. If you were to walk into an office, they'd be working side by side with GSA employees. Would the kind of employee who's sort of got on a long-term assignment to an agency and who's functionally integrated into the agency system, would that person be considered a contractor? And perhaps you might say, well, those kind of people are not working on rulemakings. Is there anything you can say by way of response to that question?
Are you thinking of like IPAs and special government employees?
No, I just think, I mean, there are a lot of people, working in the federal government because of limitations of personnel law who might have an assignment to an agency for 2-3 years. And they're functionally in many ways indistinguishable from an agency employee. They work side by side, they use the same IT systems and so forth. I don't know if you have encountered that phenomena in this context, but I'm just wondering, maybe the more general question, is there a working definition of who is a contractor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it maps down to who your employer is, right? So if they're on a term appointment, but they are, hired by the federal government, I think we would consider them an employee. If they work for a separate entity outside the federal government, but are serving, in the four walls of an agency, I think we would consider them a contractor.
So the relevant criteria is who signs their paycheck.
Yeah.
It's just that in some, you do have firms out there who are signing paychecks who do not exercise any kind of managerial supervisory authority with respect to the employee. It's entirely provided by the agency. And that's sort of the class of people that I'm thinking of and perhaps distinguishing from the kind of contractors who may play a role in the rulemaking process. But I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, those folks are contractors definitionally, right? And I think that type of relationship poses different kinds of risks from others that are less, I would use the term enmeshed.
Okay, we have 2 more questions or comments on the report. Dick Pierce.
So this is in a sense a follow-up to Matt's question. What's the difference between a contractor and a consultant? I think that a consultant is a contractor, and so I think you guys are contractors. And certainly you get all the same problems, whether you're called a consultant or a contractor. So right now we're addressing, one of the problems we're addressing is transparency. You made a bunch of commitments to the people from whom you obtain data, and you understandably need to live by those commitments, but that then impairs our ability to figure out the answers to some important questions. And it's reminiscent of the 6 City study, which has been so controversial for 20 years now, where I don't know if you call them contractors or consultants, but they made commitments to the people from whom they have obtained data that then made it very, very difficult for EPA or anybody who was challenging the findings to figure out what was going on because of lack of transparency. So is there a real difference between a consultant and a contractor?
Not really. There's a distinction here, which is that often those terms are used interchangeably, right? And I think that Matt's prior point about who signs your paycheck is often the important delineating factor. OPM does have special authority to hire people on short-term stints and make them federal employees, and they do call some of those people consultants, which is confusing. But often when we're talking about consultants like Bridget and I, we are hired on a contract and we are contractors. So I think the official OPM term kind of clouds things a bit, but generally these terms are interchangeable. Bridget, did you have anything to add?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, great. And I just flagged the opening sentence of your report, which is that across the board, even outside of the context of rulemaking, that contractors are ubiquitous in the federal government. Noelle, next. You're next.
Thanks, Carrie. And thanks, Bridget and Rachel, for your hard work with this report. Just wanted to kind of talk or really ask you about, or maybe not any of those things, flag a consideration here. And that is, your report does mention the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And just to kind of add a little more, for your knowledge and for your purposes, in terms of what may be constraining or governing the things that contractors can and can't do, another consideration that you might want to be aware of is the role of contractors and FACA, right? Federal Advisory Committee Act. And I just flag that because, at least if anyone's familiar with the Bristol Bay litigation over the Pebble Mine deposit in Alaska, the plaintiffs in that case were able to make a lot of hay over EPA's use of contractors in developing the proposed determination that was challenged in that litigation. They basically argued that EPA formed de facto advisory committees by consulting with its contractors in like simultaneously, basically in violation of FACA. And that argument, as you may know, the agency ultimately settled the case, but that argument did survive summary judgment. So at least one judge thought that it had merit. And so just to kind of flag that in addition to the FAR, which you all really go into a lot of detail about, other things such as FACA may be considerations in how agencies utilize their contractors, because Bristol Bay has been a cautionary tale for not just EPA, but for a lot of others as well. So just flagging that for your consideration. And then sort of unique to EPA as well, it's kind of piggybacking off of Mac and Dick's comments. And this is like another kind of situation where it's not, is it a contractor? Is it an employee? Is it something else? EPA has Cs, right? Senior environmental employees, which are basically retired Americans that are brought on to perform various tasks. And those persons are not EPA employees, or not federal employees, they're grantees. And I don't know, if that would complicate, I don't know if they would be considered contractors. I don't know enough about any of that stuff to really opine on that. But just like FYI as well, there are these weird like gray areas, just for your knowledge.
Thank you very much, Noelle. Any response or final comments, Rachel or Bridget?
I mean, just thank you. And I'll follow up to get, some of the details on that so we can fold that into the report. I mean, we found so many, clever, innovative, workarounds that agency managers are doing to get good expertise in. And so it does not surprise me that despite the fact that we have this laundry list in the report, that there are other things like the program you described that, are just different. So yeah, we'd love to know more about that and the case you mentioned. I'll send you a note.
Okay, let's see. Do we have one more comment or question that came in here? Is it Miriam? You have a question?
Yeah, just one follow-up comment. I don't know that we would ever use these folks in a rulemaking situation. But in addition to EPA's grantees, NARA actually has a whole cadre of volunteers that are there. So they're under the NARA Foundation, which is self-funded, but so they're out of the appropriations and they get to volunteer their time, and they're not, it's, okay under ethics, and they do various things. They don't work on rulemaking as far as I know, because they do other stuff, but I mean, they don't get paid. They're not under a contract, but they have to abide by a bunch of other stuff. So there's another twist.
Thank you. I think, even though you may not have had a full slice of all federal agencies and you can't deal with the prevalence question, one thing that's revealed with even the small slice is the great degree of variation and variability in the uses. And I should highlight, just for any committee member who just saw your presentation, that the tables you presented were not necessarily what like any single agency might be using all of those contractors for all of those functions, but across all of your interviews and surveys, these are the range of uses. Some agencies might just have one, or a couple smattered around in that table. But okay, I'd like to shift gears and turn to the draft recommendations and start going through that. Obviously, the kinds of questions that you've asked and the issues in the report can help inform the development of the preamble. And before we end today, if there's time, I'd certainly like to and welcome coming back to the preamble for any comments about what it might profitably contain in the first full draft of the preamble that will take place after today's meeting. But given that it's only sketched out at this point in time, I think we can best use our time by turning to the actual draft recommendation paragraphs. And Kasia, I wonder if you can share that draft and we can start working our way through it together as a committee. We will start with these general considerations relating to the use of contractors. Recommendations 1 and 2 then are offering some guidance and urging agencies to consider, I would say, more thoughtfully perhaps than they may at present, perhaps in some cases, but at least to suggest that that kind of consideration be given as to what are the advantages and potential disadvantages of moving to contractors in the rulemaking context. Open it up for any comments or suggestions, reactions from any member of the committee. We'll just take this first recommendation starting at line 43 at the outset and see if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to share on it. And just feel free to use your raise hand function once you've taken a look at this, or use the chat and I can recognize you. If there are no comments or questions, we can move to number 2, but I can also give you another. I see Jerry Mishaw may be trying to be recognized. Jerry, did you? Or do you?
I was attempting to do that. For some reason, my hand raise function blinks off after a couple of seconds. No, I don't know if others had the same reaction. In reading this first recommendation and second one, it seemed to me that it's highly likely that agencies, in fact, think about what they're doing. And there's a certain suggestion here that people are engaging in I don't know what, some sort of crocodile brain reaction and hire contractors without thinking about it. If there's some way to massage this so that it doesn't have that sort of implication. And the second thing that struck me was that in suggesting that people think about doing something different, there is perhaps implicit in that the suggestion that there are risks in hiring contractors that don't exist with respect to these other options, and that therefore hiring contractors is a sort of should not be a default reaction, but perhaps others didn't get that implication from it.
Thank you for that. I'm going to take by when you are referring to the other options, you're also referring to what is paragraph 2 as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. I mean, I will have to say, Jerry, I give you my own reaction, and I don't speak for the committee. And so if the committee doesn't share this, I thought 1 and 2 might profitably go into the preamble, perhaps. It's general considerations, and these are the sorts of issues that agencies presumably will want to take into account. I don't know whether whether putting them in a recommendation itself leads to the kind of I don't know, perhaps a little bit of condescension, and that's not the word you were using, but I'm just trying to build on your point about softening a bit. That could happen in the way this is worded in the recommendation, or perhaps putting these items in the preamble. There isn't really a strong recommendation beyond that agencies do some thinking here, but I just put that out there maybe to get a little bit of conversation going, and certainly ask and recognize our consultant, Bridget Dooling, if she has any reaction.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. So I guess I'll just, for the benefit of the committee's discussion, I'll just say that the way we conceived of this type of recommendation was that it would not be the thing you do right before you're about to go out for a contract, that it would be like a general stock taking exercise to sort of step back and say, okay, we've sort of made these decisions about the use of contractors in rulemaking, maybe on an ad hoc basis. Let's take a step back and look at how contractors are playing a role in rulemaking across the agency, and are we comfortable with how we use them, right? Are we using them too little? Are we using them too much? Like, how does this jive with how we want to do our human capital planning? So just to say, I think we envision this as a larger stock taking exercise, not the thing you do right before you decide whether to, request a contractor.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. Birchall.
So I think I feel a little whiplash when I read the first 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph gives me a sense of, oh, contractors might be a good idea. Here are the things that they can provide that are quite helpful to you as an agency. And then the second paragraph reads to me as dissuading me from hiring contractors. And so I was wondering if there is a way or a thought in which there could be a little bit, maybe the symmetry just added to the first paragraph, by accounting for possible reasons to hire contractors, and then perhaps including within that first paragraph some reasons why you may not want to hire contractors, and then sort of a second paragraph that provides alternatives to contractors is a thought that I had, because for some reason those 2 paragraphs just left me with a little whiplash.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good point. And but your comment also leads me just to flag for the committee's benefit, if Kasia, if you could just scroll up to what is in the outline sketched for the preamble. There is also already there this, if you go up, I think to the first page, these bullet points here, the reasons to use a contractor, and then some of the challenges and associated with them. Just flagging that some of this consideration of the stock taking and when to use it is indicated as already possibly fitting into a preamble. Elena?
Hi, yes, it's Elena.
Elena, sorry.
No problem. I'm here on behalf of Rebecca Orban from the Coast Guard. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things. And I think actually Bridget's response earlier maybe gets at one of them. When I read number 1, especially, I don't read it as sort of do like a stock taking exercise. And it's been my experience that at least some of the time, it reads as if this is something you should do like once you decide you have a need for rulemaking. And my experience is that a lot of the contracting activities that go on are sort of continuous activities. You're not like, starting a rulemaking and saying, okay, we're going to need someone who's going to provide us with some, technical editing, document formatting type support, let's go get a contractor for that. We have someone already who's in a contractor role. And so that it reads as if you should sort of make all these decisions each time you're undertaking a specific rulemaking. And I know at the Coast Guard, for example, we do hundreds of rulemakings every year, most of them not very significant. And it sounds like from what Bridget said, that's not actually what they intended anyway. And so maybe there's an edit to make it a little clearer that the idea behind, I think it sounded like maybe 1 and 2 is to recommend agencies undertake sort of a broader analysis or thought about how they're approaching contractors in their rulemaking activities generally. And to me, that wasn't how it read.
That's helpful. Yeah, very helpful, Elena. I see definitely the point you're making here. It says, when considering and before retaining a contractor, for example. And this is ultimately up to the committee. It may be that the committee thinks that it is important to have a specific called out recommendation before retaining even a single contractor. Or
I think there's a whole subset of contractors where that is appropriate, right? Like you're, in a previous role at a different agency, we contracted for some research on specific points. We had a very specific set of questions we were trying to get answered and didn't have the expertise in-house. And, we made very deliberate decisions about what options are available to us to get that, and, concluded we needed a contractor. And so, I think some of the time that is very much what's happening. And then there's this whole other body of contractors that you saw on the chart doing sort of a lot of sort of ongoing maintenance type work that just has to get done.
Right. And yeah. And there's also then this separate question, and it's up for, you as the committee. Do you want to make sure it's clear to recommend some kind of global stock taking and thoughtful process of articulating reasons to use contractors or not? If the latter, one thing I would just flag also is that there are some later draft recommendations about developing a written policy, and maybe if it's the stock taking that the committee wants to recommend, it might be clear and presumably what you would want to do in connection with or preceding the development of a written policy. So just flagging that for discussion. Thank you, Elena. Kevin, you're next.
Thanks so much. I was thinking on this, maybe to pick up on Bertrell's point, and then it'll lead it back to something that Carrie said, which is on the first paragraph, I do feel the need for, we have possible reasons to hire. And I think that if we're going to do a kind of more general stock taking, I think it really is important to have possible considerations and concerns. And so that I think could either go towards this feels more preambulatory, or it could be more specified, a set of concerns that you should address in the stock taking. And I think then and this could come up in the preamble too, I wonder whether there's also the dynamic effect of what is the effect of having contractors over time. You note nicely in the report that this is a management question, but there's also a question sort of over time, retaining the right management capacity so you can really see what the contractors are doing. So I just wanted to flag that as a concern, both for the preamble and here, depending on whether it becomes preambulatory or otherwise. Sort of, I guess maybe a shorthand for maybe that sort of hollowing out effect.
Good. Do you have an inclination of where it should situate?
I don't. To me, this now it currently looks like to me more preambulatory. But following up on just the prior comment, I could see a more articulated version of we want you to take stock along the following dimensions, and certainly paragraph 2 is beginning to do that work. So I think that would be really a useful step to me. It seems like.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin. Emily.
Hi. So I just want to start off by saying that I'm sorry I missed the first hour of the meeting, and I'm a little hesitant to sort of jump in now. And so I apologize in advance if things I say have already been said. I had a pre-existing commitment that I couldn't change, and I apologize for that. I agree with what Kevin was just saying, paragraph 1 to me reads more like preambulatory text. It also reads to me like a sort of a very high level summary of reasons that apply to a wide range of circumstances that I'm not sure how helpful it maybe is. And more broadly, I'll just say I really appreciate the report that the consultants put together. I found it fascinating and frankly sort of provocative. And I'm just going to admit that I have really mixed feelings about all of this, actually. I was very surprised at some of the uses of contractors in rulemaking. Some of them strike me as totally appropriate, but I'm actually not totally sure how I feel about all of it yet. Like I feel like I haven't had enough time for it to sort of sink in, and I feel like I need to hear the views of my fellow committee members before my views maybe firm up a little bit. So like a lot of it's fine. The thing that I find really troubling was the idea of using contractors to draft rules. That just struck me as over the line. I understand that the available guidance doesn't say that, but my initial reaction, at least, was that seems wrong. And then on the transparency issues, and I know we're not there in terms of the recommendation yet, like I also had sort of mixed feelings about that, because on the one hand, I want to know what's happening, and also I was really quite persuaded by the consultants' arguments about the potential downsides of transparency. But a lot of this, and I realize I'm sort of addressing bigger issues, but I guess I hope, and maybe we've already done this in the previous hour, but I hope that we can kind of come to some general views, maybe among the committee, about the direction of the recommendation before we spend too much time wordsmithing recommendation text. I mean, this is a project, and I feel like this with a lot of projects, but I'm feeling it really acutely with this one, that that maybe we would be better spent figuring out how we feel about it before we start wordsmithing specific recommendations. Maybe other people are further along than I am. I don't feel that I'm there yet, and I worry that value could be lost by diving too much into wordsmithing of recommendations. And the other thing is, generally speaking, for this recommendation, my present feeling is that we might be better off highlighting this phenomenon and making a relatively short list of well thought out and targeted recommendations to address the things that the committee feels are really the places where attention is needed, rather than doing what I think we do in a lot of recommendations, where we're dealing with issues that we're very familiar with, that are well known, and where we can give kind of, I think, broader ranging advice than at least I feel at the moment equipped to opine on this subject that for me seems like a new kind of combination of considerations. And I'll stop talking there.
Thank you very much, Emily. Appreciate your sharing that, and it would encourage other committee members, if you want to share what an overall orientation to contracting in the rulemaking context, to certainly feel free to do that. And also weighing in here on either one or two, and whether we should keep these largely as they are, or modify them in some way, even if we don't get to full wordsmithing of them. Suggestions like Jerry Mishaw had of softening it would be helpful, or whether it should go in a preamble would be also helpful. Noelle, you're next.
Thank you. So before I kind of go into my comment, is it okay if I kind of take us back a little bit to the first page?
On the preamble?
Yes, the preamble.
Yeah, or the sketch of, or skeleton of a preamble, right? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think there's a portion of that talks about the legal considerations, and then that goes into the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or is it the intergovernmental functions? There it is. It's 3. Yes.
Yep.
So paragraph 3. So I'm still sort of thinking through what might be the most helpful for kind of concretizing this thought. So sorry if I'm sort of stream of consciousness just for a moment. But, you know, the FACA issue, I mean, it's very possible that that's just something that maybe we feel a little more cautious about than others. I'm just not sure how often that comes up in other contexts, but just sort of speaking for myself from a staff level, I think we should at least, in addition to the, you know, IGFs and those legal considerations surrounding that, somehow capture that there might be other things legal that should be considered, you know, maybe something broader than just like calling out FACA. Because I mean, that is sort of an influx issue. I know that Congress is in the process of trying to apply FACA to contractors and make that a little more concrete and close that loophole up. So it's very much in flux. All that just say, I'm not sure I want to call out FACA specifically in this context, but maybe something that like generally refers to other legal considerations associated with, I don't know, engaging with non-Fed or something like that. You know, I'm still thinking about that, but just flagging that for your consideration in how or whether we can incorporate that there. Something I'm thinking about. And then
that's an excellent suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I don't want to jump ahead. I had
no,
another
go ahead. No,
Okay.
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead by all means.
I don't know if we're going in order. So there was another portion, I'm just trying to pull it up.
In the preamble still?
No, sorry. This is in the actual recommendation. And
okay, in the actual recommendation, then you may be jumping ahead. We're at 1 and 2. Is it in the first 2 paragraphs at all?
No, so I guess I'll save it.
Unless there's, I don't see any other hands up. So if it's in 3, we can take one. And I guess I'm going to suggest we come back to 1 and 2 and maybe make a decision in a bit whether we should reword this, move it to the preamble or something. But let's take a look at 3. And I don't know, Noelle, if this was the part that you were going to comment on yet.
No, mine's way down, so I'll hold on.
Okay, maybe if we could just hold that for a little bit, that would be very much appreciated. Let me turn to these paragraphs here about inherently governmental functions. And maybe in the spirit that Emily Bremer was suggesting, we don't necessarily, I certainly invite any wordsmithing, but also just general reactions of the kind that we've just exchanged on paragraphs 1 and 2. Certainly welcome those kind of comments as well. So let's take number 3, where agencies should adopt and disseminate policies to ensure that agency personnel do not contract out inherently governmental functions and so forth. So Stephanie.
Yeah, hi everyone. Some of these recommendations are directed at OMB, and so we did take a close look at them. I sent over some comments in writing this morning, so hopefully everybody has that. Kasia, I don't know if you need me to re-offer the line edits or if you already have those, but
I have them, so I'll go ahead and type those in right now. if that's
awesome.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that?
We had essentially 2 comments. The first was just to streamline the references to OMB, OFPP, and OIRA to OMB. And the reasoning for that is that the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs are both offices situated within OMB, and we're perfectly capable of sorting out for ourselves like who should do which aspect of the ACUS recommendation. I think it would be both of us. And so we just didn't think we needed to distinguish between those entities and could target a recommendation at OMB. We are absolutely amenable to the committee's suggestion that we should consider guidance and consider current agencies' practice. In recommendation 4, if I'm not jumping too far ahead, I thought that it might
that's
be
fine. They're connected.
That it
Go
might be
ahead.
helpful. Thanks, Carrie, to use the consider language in relation to the assessment of whether current agency practices align with broader procurement best practices, in addition to consider issuing guidance. And one reason that I thought that is just because if the wealth of recommendations currently before the committee are actually implemented by agencies that would actually build a pretty large evidentiary base and set of information about agencies' contracting and rulemaking practices. And as a result of that, you know, I'm not sure whether or not further OMB research would be needed. It might be. If the committee thinks that it would be and that this should remain a should, certainly we're open to that feedback as well. So I think that those were the primary comments. There was also a note to the committee asking whether or not the recommendation itself should identify which rulemaking functions might be over the line as inherently governmental functions. That would be helpful to OMB as it was considering whether or not to put out guidance on this issue. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Bridget, do you have any?
Just following up on Steph's comments there. Thanks for those. The stronger version of this, right, is a recommend for the, you know, as the committee thinks about how to frame these recommendations, the stronger version of this is to lean in and, you know, push OMB to actually change its guidance for rulemaking activities. And so the language here, you know, puts the onus on OMB to at least, you know, take the factual findings of the report in these proceedings and do its own thinking about whether those policies need to change. ACUS could, of course, go further and say the policies should change. And so this is the more deferential of the two. But, you know, so just in terms of, as we think about our shoulds and coulds and shall considers, like, I think that this is already something of a fallback from a main recommendation, which could sort of, you know, put the onus on OMB to go ahead and make specific changes.
And it might be that if you have to consider, in the process of considering assessing, you are also assessing. Assessing isn't like, it's a pretty flexible term perhaps too. Kazia, could you just scroll up a little so we could see both 3 and 4 and see if there's any other comments on either 3 or 4? And let me also, you know, flag and invite any comments from the committee or ACUS members about whether ACUS in this recommendation should try to give any greater clarity about what the lines are or might be between inherently governmental functions related to rulemaking and other activities. I don't know whether anybody has any views about whether this committee should try to make that, should try to weigh in on defining that line or giving more specific examples, or as I think this is drafted, invite others to consider that further. Emily?
As I noted before, I think and maybe this is just an intuition that is wrong, and if so, I'd like to hear why. But my initial inclination in reading the report was to say that it seems wrong to me that drafting rules would be on the close to, but not actually inherently governmental functions. Like you know, the work of writing rules that are going to be legally binding and writing the preamble that explains the rationale for those rules and their legal basis and the response to comments strikes me as squarely within the proper obligations of agency officials. And so my sort of starting point was to think that it would be entirely appropriate for us to make a recommendation as to whether or not the line has just been drawn in not quite the right place. And maybe my intuition isn't shared by others on the committee, in which case, you know, then that's fine. But I see lots of hands, so I would really love to hear other people's reactions.
Emily, can I just ask you, this is Matt, I just have just a quick question for you. In terms of drawing this line, is it a line that's necessarily drawn by reference to the inherently governmental functions test, or could it be that something is not an inherently governmental function, but just as sort of as a matter of administrative justice, it's not a good practice?
Yeah, I think you're right that because I'm less. I mean, I'm familiar with the inherently governmental test, but that's not the perspective I'm coming from. I think the latter option you offer is as sort of a sort of more broader consideration of sort of basic administrative justice is probably where my inclination is coming from.
And is your inclination, when you say drafting, is that drafting the preamble or drafting the actual rule text or both?
I mean, I would say preambles and rules. I was very surprised that that's work that would be done by contractors. That struck me as, I think if you had asked me before reading the report, do agencies do that? I would have assumed the answer was no, because it seems sort of obviously inappropriate. Now, it's entirely possible that I'm missing something, that there are circumstances in which that is done and where it's appropriate. But if that's the case, then I think a recommendation that explains the circumstances in which it would be appropriate might be a good recommendation, because I would not be willing to sort of sign on to the proposition that in all circumstances it is appropriate for an agency to contract out to private people who are not given the authority by the statute to make legally binding rules, the ability to draft those rules.
Now, how would that be different? I'm just going to ask one follow-on, and then I know we've got a long question. But we have a rulemaking process that openly invites public comment. And I'm a member of the public. I look at a notice of proposed rulemaking and I say, no, agency, the way you should draft this rule is not XYZ, but ZYX. And the agency looks at that and says, you know, ZYX is better. We should adopt this language that came in from a public comment. They're a private entity. Does that change anything here? I mean, it's still ultimately some governmental decision maker who's processing that input, right?
Yeah,
whether it's coming from a comment or from a contractor.
Yeah, for me, that absolutely changes it. If it's an agency decision maker who's receiving the comment, responding to it, and changing what they are drafting in response to public comments, that strikes me as very different than contracting out the responsibility for sorting through comments or drafting regulatory text. I just think those two activities are going to put you in a totally different frame of mind, and one in which some measure of the policy making is going to be given out in the example of contracting that isn't given out in the example of the agency responding to and reacting to comments in the way it drafts. That is, and when I say it, I mean employees of the agency draft the rule. Those just strike me as fundamentally different. And the other thing is, you know, one thing that the report notes that could be a reason would be, well, the agency doesn't feel it has adequate expertise. And to that, I guess that gives me serious concern, because the whole rationale for having agencies write rules is that they have the expertise. And if they don't have the expertise at the beginning of a rulemaking, then I think the way you get that expertise is by doing the rulemaking. And so I worry that the solution of contracting to supply expertise the agency doesn't possess could, at least in certain circumstances, actually make the problem worse that it's trying to solve.
Okay, we've got a lot. Thank you very much, Emily. David Pritzker, you're next.
Hi, those who know me won't be surprised at this comment. But as I read paragraph 3 and the marginal note from Kaja on the side, my immediate reaction is, what about reg neg? I think that if the recommendation is going to have language like this, there ought to be at least some recognition that in the instance of negotiated rulemaking, the agency wants a draft coming from outside. A footnote to what I've just been saying is that, of course, this opens up questions of the scope of the role of the contract convener or facilitator and who's doing the actual writing, because that person may be a contractor. The other members of the Reg Neg committee are not contractors. But my point in brief is that if we're going to recommend anything like this, there ought to be some recognition that that's a special case.
Thank you very much, David. Elena.
Hi, so I wanted to respond to what Emily was talking about, and I wanted to say, I think that without going back and asking the questions again, something like drafting the rule is potentially open to interpretation. And it's hard to know exactly how the person asked interpreted that. I would never have a contractor just be like, here's a rule, please go draft it. But I have been in meetings where we have talked about responses and perhaps the contractor is acting more as the scribe and going and taking it, or maybe they're taking a matrix where we've sort of put responses into a spreadsheet and they're sort of translating that into full sentences in a document. And someone could easily have interpreted that activity as, yes, I draft the preamble. And I think it's hard to know. It's potentially impossible to know what the person responding to those questions was thinking when they're like, yeah, we use contractors to draft the rule. I think even something like Emily mentioned, like sorting through comments. Well, what does that mean, right? Does that mean looking at the comments and thinking about what those comments mean and whether you should adopt them? I think that's much more of a governmental function. But if you mean sorting them and well, these two comments are very much the same, let's group them together, let's put them all into a log so we know what we're dealing with. Those are two potentially different interpretations of that mean very different things and could affect the way that people are responding to things. So I think that I don't know if that makes you feel any better, but it's very possible that some of these words are being used in much more routine ways than they might sound on their face. So I just wanted to sort of offer that up, right. Hopefully make people feel a little bit better. I would never just be like, here go draft a rule. But there is a lot of work that happens in advance of the actual drafting something. So.
Right. No, it's in many hands a kind of enterprise often, and I will flag that recommendation 3 does leave it to the agency to develop the policy. So there's room to define drafting how they like, to address negotiated rulemaking if they like, right? So it is not. It would be, I think, a different story if either 3 or 4 were proposing that ACUS itself, define where these lines are. But as drafted now, at least 3 and 4 are, I think, leaving that up to the agency, and in 4 to OMB perhaps. Elizabeth Cole. You're next.
Yeah, hi. I'm here for DOT, but as a member of the public, I guess this is not our
Okay.
committee. But I just wanted to.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth. Yes, because you're not a member of the committee, so I just want to reiterate, and you're not a member of ACUS, that just absent any consent from the committee members, that you'll be allowed to speak. So I'll just defer to Carrie on that real quick.
Unless I hear an objection, Elizabeth, you may speak.
Great, thank you.
Oh, thank you. So I am just on the issue of contractors drafting preamble text. I was at the energy department before I came over here to transportation, and we had very large technical rules to develop standards, right, for commercial furnaces, that kind of thing. And we had a lot of analyses that went into those rulemakings, life cycle cost analyses, for example, manufacturer impact analysis, all kinds of analyses that helped us set standards. And the contractors who did those analyses, some of them, I should also point out, are our management and operating contractors who we have long-standing, since Oak Ridge National Lab, right, relationships with these contractors. And so they do a lot of that technical analysis and then also write that part of the preamble, just say, this is how we did the analysis, these are the results, right? So it's not policy making, but it's big sections of the rule document, and to have that cut out or cut off, it would be problematic, I would think, for that. So I just offer that as a perspective.
Thank you. That's valuable to hear. Andrew, you're next.
Thanks, Carrie. First of all, I want to apologize because I missed some of the beginning of our conversation because as irony would have it, I got a call from an agency who wanted to talk to me about supporting some rulemaking drafting and comments analysis. But a couple of things. One is one of the things, if you are doing rulemaking in an agency, and if an agency is going to pursue a rulemaking, one of the first things they have to do is identify the problem they're solving for. So it's the most important thing. And here I'm just a little bit at a loss for the problem that we're solving for. And so that sort of, I found the report really interesting. But as far as identifying a clear problem that we are going to solve for, that it wasn't perfectly clear to me. And another thing I thought was just the general irony of what we're talking about here is, and maybe you guys joked about this at the beginning, but the fact that we're talking about a contractor documents that this federal agency of ACUS will issue to agencies that could have a huge sort of policy and a cost impact on agencies. So we're sort of doing here precisely what we're talking about, which I think is kind of interesting. I thought Elena's point, I totally agree with as far as the role of the contractor, whether you're writing the reg text, preamble text, or dealing with public comments. We do that all the time. As far as that's what contractors do, but we do not do any policy making. If for writing the regulatory text, you could be in a meeting with the agency staff, and as a contractor, your role might be to take notes and find out people are throwing out ideas. We want to do this, or go write some reg text that will do these 5 things, and could you just get a draft that does this, and the team would make a decision. You as the contractor, and this is a role that could be done by someone in the agency or a contractor, but you can write out a first draft, and then people are going to review it and make edits to it. And maybe someone will send you comments and saying, hey, may add these things to the text. So you're just sort of, a scribe and writing up drafts, but it's not that the contractor is doing any policy making. They're just supporting the team and helping do some drafting. Maybe you have, writing skills and you're doing the drafting. So whether you're writing the regulatory text in that way or preamble language, again, it's all based on input from the agency and all reviewed often over years ad nauseum by the agency. And the same thing with the comments analysis. And sort of interesting with the comments analysis, if you're doing like a summary of comments, the agency has to be fully apprised of what the issues are that are raised by commenters. And if the contractor does a poor job of helping identify accurately to the agency staff what the issues are, the agency is going to be open to a lawsuit. And that's sort of a big check on it. So the idea that the contractor would manipulate things and hide issues, well, the organizations that send in those issues are going to be very mindful that their issues were addressed by the agency, and they will sue the agency if they fail to address them. So the concern that the contractor might be in some nefarious way manipulating things by burying issues, the trade groups and the organizations out there, they're not going to be fooled by that. And I might even be thrilled if someone foolishly buried or left out an issue, because they could leave the door wide open for litigation. So that I think is, and I think it's in cases that are sort of similar to what you were bringing up, Carrie, the whole idea of, a public comment comes in and the agency agrees with it. Well, one of the things is if the agency agrees with it, the agency doesn't just say, hey, we agree with Carrie's comment, we're going to do it. The agency actually has to lay out its reasoning for why it agrees. Why does the agency, you're the one who's delegated this authority from Congress to make the decision. Why do you agree with Carrie? And that's the same thing with all the rest of this stuff. The agency has to articulate its reasoning and what it believes. And there's so many lines of review within the agency that is just a contractor made this decision entirely on their own, and the government agency was not involved. I just don't see that happening.
And let me just ask if Bridget or Rachel have anything in what they uncovered that is contrary to what Andrew was saying, or do you, from your interviews and survey results, do you come away with a sense that there's contractors run amok, so to speak, I might put it that way, or the more responsible, interactive kind of use of contractors that Andrew, I think, is describing. Any comments from our consultants?
I can make a few comments, which is just reiterating the point that we really encountered so much variation, and I agree with some of the points that were raised, that drafting doesn't mean the same thing to every agency. And so in a lot of our interviews, we really tried to say, what does it mean when you say you had a contractor draft the reg text? And it means different things. And we really tried to parse that in these conversations. And so sometimes we heard from people that we don't have writers on staff, and our people are engineers or whatever they are, some really technical specialty, and they don't know how to write well. And it's a real problem. And so we get contractors to actually do the drafting. And it's maybe along sometimes in some agencies, the way Andrew described it, which is like, we have a meeting, we all sit down, and then you go write, and then we come back. And we heard a lot from agency officials about having oversight, and oversight being the key thing that makes sure that the agency is making the decisions in these cases. And that seems fine and well, but one thing we noted is that agencies don't always know, right, at the leadership level or the management level, who is a contractor and who's not, and who did what in a rule. So making sure that that oversight functions in the correct way might not, it might sometimes work well, and it might not always work well. And so again, there's just a lot of variation in practice. I don't know if Bridget has other comments to add.
Yeah, I think I would just add that I think you should all think about this in terms of being on a continuum of contractor. I keep coming back to the term enmeshment into the policymaking process. So you've got some where they're very much at arm's length, and you've got some where the contractor is seen as part of the agency team. It's seamless, it's cohesive, there's trust there both ways, there's gratification both ways, like everyone feels like this is a well-oiled machine. The fact that you happen to be a contractor isn't particularly important to the manager overseeing the work. They view you in the way they view their own staff. And so that is where we start to wonder, if the conflicts, for example, are more opaque, if there isn't that sort of constant vigilance, what that might mean for the views, the opinions of that contractor making its way into the agency process, not nefariously, but because they were invited in, right, by the agency manager. So you don't have to think about a contractor twiddling his or her mustache, right, in order for this to resonate. This is more about workflow and the extent to which contractors are treated as agency staff in the day-to-day, and not just for a 3-month sprint necessarily, but maybe over 3 to 5 years over the long haul. And the way that that very natural human interaction is going to, help develop, good trusting relationships.
Thanks. Dick, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
I had 2 points. One was just really, as much a question as anything else. It ties in with some of the subsequent discussion, but I don't understand Emily's point that she objects to having contractors involved in the process of drafting preambles and rules. Isn't that what we're doing today? What we've done is what ACUS does constantly. We rely on contractors to do everything up to the point where they provide drafts of preambles and drafts of rules, and then we discuss them, and we're the ultimate deciders. But the heavy lifting has all been done before we get to it, and as a practical matter, we all know from experience that the people, he who holds the pen has the power, and so those initial drafters have a lot of power. But that's what we're doing today. So is what we're doing today something that is objectionable? And the second point is, throughout all of this, we're talking about conflicts of interest, and there's certainly ways in which contractors can have conflicts of interest that agency employees don't. There is one important way in which contractors have less conflict of interest than employees. Contractors are barred from making contributions to federal political campaigns. And so I hope our 2 contractors today realize they cannot make any contributions to, anytime I was an ACUS contractor, I knew that was it. I can't make any campaign contributions this year. And that's true of all contractors. Employees are not barred from doing that. You know, an employee of ACUS could, for instance, make a $100,000 dark money contribution to the president and then use it to turn around and influence a whole bunch of things. Whereas a contractor is absolutely forbidden from having any potential role of that type.
Thank you for sharing that. That's helpful. And Emily, you're on the queue because Dick mentioned you. I'm happy to, if Virtual is okay with it, let Emily respond. Thank you, Virtual.
Yeah, so I thought quite a bit about the fact that ACUS uses consultants. I do think it's different. And I think it's different in part because our statute designs us to operate this way. And this is how Congress contemplates that we would operate. And it's perfectly transparent what inputs are coming from the consultant. And usually, you know, the folks who are members of ACUS precisely because they are experts in the subject matter, so that we're not coming to this cold or anything like that. The other thing I'll say is I have preferences about the way projects are run, and one of them that I kind of alluded to earlier is I think we are better off when we don't have a draft recommendation before us at a first meeting, precisely because by writing it down, by drafting it, we often do get locked into a particular range of recommendations. And I think it profoundly affects the way the committee process operates. And I've seen projects operate in a variety of ways over my years, both as an employee of ACUS and as a member. And you know, it's different when the committee starts off with a report and a list of questions from when the committee starts off with a report and a draft recommendation. The way the process operates and the extent to which the committee members are actively drafting the recommendation varies depending on how the project is structured. And so that in a way, that experience is part of what's informing my reaction here. The other thing I'll say is we are not regulating anybody. We don't write rules with legal effect. And I mean, maybe others don't think that matters, but I do think that is a big difference between what we do and what agencies are doing in rulemaking.
Here's another difference, Emily. The ACUS contractors don't make any money. I mean, as a practical matter.
I was going to suggest that.
Don't tell them that.
As much as I understand the impulse here to focus in on what ACUS does, I do want to keep the attention on the general problem here, and not so much what ACUS does or not, but what should be in this recommendation if we go forward with a recommendation too. I mean, that's always on the table. Virtual, you're next.
So I guess I'm going to return to kind of thinking about how to structure the recommendations in this report. And it was helpful to hear Andrew's question, which was, if I'm just paraphrasing, what is the problem that we're trying to solve here, or what are the problems we're trying to solve here, which relates to Emily's point about looking at the issue holistically before going into the details. And so when I think about the problems, and maybe this could be a jumping off point in terms of thinking about the problems if I haven't captured them properly. One problem I'm thinking about is like we're thinking about guidance on when an agency should use contractors. A second one is if an agency does use a contractor, guidance on how an agency should use a contractor, how they should go about using a contractor, which might include what tasks the contractor should do or not do, and what constraints should be imposed on contractors, and how should the agency oversee the contractor. And this kind of goes to the latter point about how agencies should use the contractor, goes to Carrie's question about whether we should be providing agencies with guidance on what is an inherently governmental function. It seems that would be a critical component in terms of helping agencies and guiding them on how to use a contractor. But I also see it as a very difficult problem to solve due to the ambiguity and vagueness associated with what is an inherently governmental function. And so I wonder on that point whether we have the capacity, competency, or time to sort through that ambiguity and guidance, even though I think that that might be the most helpful for the agencies.
Thank you, Virtual. And I would say that as fabulous as the consultant report is in this case, that's not what they were charged with doing, was defining what is an inherently governmental function for us, or even what is the best way of defining the, even the good government line, even if it's not the equivalent to the IGF line. So, I mean, it may be that that's why what we have before us is recommendations that agencies think this through and come up with policies that fit their own circumstances, more than ACUS making that decision for agencies about where the line is. And I have to say, I haven't really heard anybody speaking up to say we should take on in this committee trying to draw that line for agencies. If there is that view out there, certainly I think we should hear it and make a decision about which path to go. Either it and it may be that there's also the possibility of some later ACUS study really focusing in squarely on that issue and considering that further. But this one right now I read to be giving agencies just simply a charge to think this through for themselves in ways that they might not have yet, or they might not at least have documented or done in a very systematic way. Anyway, with that, Jim, you're next.
Oh, thank you. The only point that I would like to make is that I hear continually in ACUS meetings, well, we just make recommendations and that's it. I would like to state that 11 years ago, ACUS had a big study exactly what we're studying now on contracting. And during the debates, a number of us said, there's a thing called information risk, where contractors pick up a lot of information and it stays in their head. And litigants then often go to court and look at the people who did the contractors, and the litigants, the plaintiffs mainly, hire these firms to help them write their arguments. And there were a number of people in the ACUS meetings, it's all documents, it was a long proceeding, recommended, ACUS wrote very, very strict recommendations how to get on top of what we called this information, that type of issue. Now, what I want to emphasize is what happened was after ACUS made their recommendation, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council, not only adopted ACUS recommendations, but they even tightened them. So I want to be on record. You can't underestimate the impact of an ACUS recommendation, because if any of you work with FAR, it's easier, it's second only to getting ISO or ANSI to write a standard. They really wrote a good standard. So I think we ought to remember when we write something, there's a number of very influential people that read the documents. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to suggest, we've been going for 2 hours roughly. If we stop now for a 5-minute break and reconvene at 2 o'clock, everybody can get a little bit of a break, and we'll pick back up with paragraphs 5 and 6 and keep moving forward promptly at 2 o'clock. Kasia, if we could advance to paragraphs 5 and 6. Five, 6, and 7, which can't display on the same screen, but all are about ethics. So invite the committee to take a look at these sections. Does anybody have any comments or suggestions on the ethics portion? Oh, thanks for getting 7 on there. So either we're all okay with those, or we're still coming back from our break, but I'm hearing, okay, Miriam?
There, okay, I got everything off. Or back on, I should say. I have a couple of wordsmithing sort of picky edits for 5 and 6.
Okay, good.
So for 5, beginning of line 80, instead of agencies should consider, they should evaluate
Okay.
whether there's an actual or perceived conflict of interest, not just consider whether there is one.
Mhm.
And then for 6, in the middle of line 87, if there, I mean, so if you're actually, if you've determined that there is in fact a risk, don't just consider it, actually add it. I mean, because at this point we're already making a recommendation. So I think it's really weaselly for us to recommend that they consider doing something when they've already determined that there's a risk, and if they don't do it, there's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other suggestions, Miriam, or were those the two?
That's all I had for 5 and 6.
Okay, great. Does anybody have any objections to those changes, or any other changes to suggest, or any other general reactions? And anything with respect to paragraph 7? Okay, seeing none. Kasia, how can we scroll up to?
I do have one for 7.
Oh, you do have one for 7. Okay, go ahead, Miriam.
Sorry. I mean, it's the same thing for 7 as for 6.
Mm-hmm.
Line 95, again.
Should include a clause.
Just, yeah. If you've already determined there's a risk.
And I think I would also probably add it into, now that you flagged that particular language, it need not be a clause. It could be, include language in the contract or provisions in the contract, right? I mean, maybe, but that's in the area of wordsmithing, I think. But you could say include provisions in the contract, or provision singular, I don't know. Somehow provide in the contract for this, but that's more matters of style, I would think.
Yeah, and I don't know if that would affect the FAR, or if the FAR is going to require some sort of language or whatever. I can tell you how to structure the FAR, but I don't actually read it for content.
Right. So it is somehow should ensure that the contract provides, or something like that. But we get the point, really, rather than should consider. And we could come for more fine-grained wordsmithing like that, a matter of style, at least. We certainly don't need to delve into that now, but I do think that's a substantive suggestion Miriam has made. Are there any other suggestions along those lines, or any other comments on ethics, 5, 6, or 7? Okay, hearing none, seeing no hands up, and Jim, I think your hand is still raised from a prior one. That's how I'm construing it. We'll go to number 8, internal management. And here, this is the agency should adopt and disseminate written policies relating to the use of contractors in rulemaking, and covering matters such as, and then there's items A through H, which are illustrative of what might be in those written policies. Emily.
So I find myself in the unfamiliar posture of being skeptical about a recommendation that every agency should adopt its own written policy about this. I wonder what the added value is to that, and if there's a reason why we think agencies need to write a policy as opposed to just giving them recommendations about how they should manage or how they should do internal management without the kind of intervening bureaucratic step of writing a written policy about it.
You know,
I've
this
never
may
said
not,
that before.
this may not be the answer others would agree with, but I think that what this allows is for, and it follows, I think, from the consultant's finding of the great deal of variation across agencies in how they, may need to use or find value from using contractors. It allows for flexibility rather than ACUS trying to figure out all of these things on a one-size-fits-all basis for all agencies. We essentially would be recommending here, if this were to go forward, something like what it's structured, ACUS would be saying agencies, really think this through. That's why at the beginning, when we were talking about 1 and 2, and I wondered if that was preambular, and Bridget said, well, no, that's more of a stock taking. It seems to me this is the kind of action that an agency would take after engaging in that kind of stock taking, is to now figure out for us what are the ways to make sure that we are addressing the possible risks that might be associated, even if it's sometimes risks of appearance of conflict of interest. So there's some adaptability to it. Miriam, you had your hand up. Is that a residual, or did you have more on 8?
Yes, I have more on 8.
Okay, we'll go to you, and then Bridget, I'll have you next.
Okay. So I have one overall concern on A, and then if we decide that we keep it, then I have a recommended change.
Okay, so
so my concern is that if we're saying, okay, each agency gets to decide for itself what piece of the rulemaking is an inherently governmental function and what piece isn't. That's, to me, that's problematic. But okay.
Yeah, I mean, one way of, if I may, I mean, I could respond to that. One way of reading this could be that agencies, it's encouraging agencies to not necessarily define the inherently governmental function, but rather to say, even though there may be things that are not inherently governmental functions, they're still not the type of functions in a rulemaking context that we want to have contractors deal with.
And if that's the case, if that's how we want to read this, then I think the language should be the types of rulemaking functions that are reserved for federal employees, not that should be reserved for federal employees, because then we're recommending that the agency recommend to itself. And so then that's, well, that should happen, but then who's making it happen within the agency?
I don't hear any, or invite certainly anybody to respond to that, but that looks like a meaningful change. Thank you very much, Miriam. Bridget?
Yeah, I like Miriam's contribution there. I think she pinpoints something that that's really tricky about this, which is that these decisions are left to the agencies to make. I mean, you've seen from the report, the state of the guidance from OMB now, it's quite general. And so as a practical matter, this work is being done at the agency level. Of course, it's within ACUS's purview if it's uncomfortable with that and wants to change that status quo. I raised my hand to respond to the prior comment from, I think it was Emily, just to say that, this set of internal management ideas makes sense if you think of it as following that stock taking exercise. And, for example, I don't think you would expect an agency that does no rulemaking to go through this process, but as drafted, it's just directed, generally to agencies. So I think, additional refinement would make a lot of sense here. And I think you particularly, like, the need for these kinds of policies are particularly acute where the agency relies really quite a lot on contractors. That's when you really want to make sure that you've got these controls in good shape, or where you've got contractors doing those functions that, walk right up to the line of decision making.
And let me just follow on that and just pose as a question for the committee. Would it be clear to begin actually with stock taking, policy making, and then follow with these sections on inherently governmental functions or on ethics? In some sense, it's the policy, the stock taking and the policy that creates this. We could conceive of it this way. I'm open to whatever the committee wants to do, but you could start with that as the overall rubric, and a little bit like how 8C refers to subsequent paragraphs. All of the other aspects of what's in this draft recommendation could be, content that goes into the agency's own written policies created after their stock taking exercise. Anyway, that's just some food for thought. Nick?
Thanks. Related to this exchange, the language from the FAR about inherently governmental functions that's quoted on page 12 of the report, which I take it as one of the authoritative texts here. It says this definition is a policy determination, not a legal determination. And I'm just wondering if the consultants or anyone else in the meeting has any sense of what the background of what that language is. I mean, why is this in the FAR considered to be policy and not law? Does that have implications for kind of who's supposed to do it? For whether we're merely like applying authority here, or whether we're kind of originating new policy, if we, the agency, do this kind of thing.
Anybody on the committee have an answer for that, or one of our consultants? Bridget, did you want to respond directly to that?
I think it's a great question, Nick, and I don't know the answer, but you raising the question sort of reveals to me that what I have sort of assumed that meant was an effort to sever it from the set of actions that's reviewable on the back end. Like, the agency's determination of this is not reviewable. And so that's sort of how I've thought about it, but I don't actually know the roots of this. And I think I would welcome, if anybody knows the story there, and it's possible colleagues not on this call, perhaps at GSA or OFPP might know more of the history there.
Okay, Emily?
So I agree with your suggestion, Carrie, about sort of moving this up and framing it more as a stock taking exercise. And I think, to kind of elaborate on my initial comment, I think what that looks like and what it might appropriately look like could vary quite a bit from agency to agency. So, it might be that if there's for a particular agency that uses contractors frequently in the rulemaking process, it might make sense, and it might be appropriate and a good use of effort to have a written policy specifically about that subject. I have a sort of a question, which is, do agencies have written policies that address these kinds of subjects for contractors generally? And if so, it might be appropriate that, you know, some agencies might think it's a better use of our resources and more efficient for the way we work to put, you know, some provisions about rulemaking functions in other more general contractor sort of policy documents. And then lastly, I think, you know, this list of subjects that we have in paragraph 8, I think one of the reasons I'm finding it a little unsatisfying as a recommendation is because it's just sort of an it's just a list of subjects, which I know, you know, they might or might not be useful to, I mean, like some agencies might deal with some of these more than others and whatever. It strikes me as the kind of list that might be better off in a preamble as like the kinds of things that agencies should think about. And to the extent that we have more narrow targeted recommendations about how agencies should deal with some of these subjects, and I'm not saying we need to have, you know, comprehensive recommendations about all these subjects, but there may be one or two that we feel based on the current inputs into this process, we have, you know, some views about specific recommendations for what those policies should look like. Narrow it down to, even if it's just a few things that we feel strongly about, that we can actually give agencies more concrete guidances about, as opposed to just a list of things very broadly to consider. And with the recognition that it's possible that this is a subject that we need to return to in future recommendations. I mean, I think I would rather us give a concise, well-targeted, thought-through recommendation as opposed to a really general recommendation that doesn't do much except sort of define the scope of the issue of the sort of field.
Thank you, Emily. And I certainly would add that sometimes a preamble can be as helpful as the actual numbered paragraphs, and so I certainly could see, if the committee wanted to go in this direction, that, as you say, a lot of these points could be discussed in the preamble. This is what a written policy could contain, and then we make a recommendation. Agencies should have a written policy, and essentially leave it at that, or somewhere in the middle could be the written policy should at least address, you know, ethics, conflicts of interest, let's say, you know, inherently governmental function, transparency, or something like that. And then we do have already in this draft some more detailed recommendations on those subjects. Now, some of them themselves call for policies, like the inherently governmental function recommendation that we were just talking about. You know, recommendations 3 and 4 themselves call for policy, somebody to articulate a policy on those. But any other comments about 8? Then let's turn to 9 and 10 and 11. These are more specific recommendations with respect to some types of management controls. The 9 is, again, should consider adopting training and the designation of an office or officer to answer questions about how to use contractors in rulemaking. Any comments on 9? Okay, seeing none. 10 has addressing and making sure contractors and employees are aware of, I think, where who's doing what. Steph?
apologies for the background noise. I appreciated the comment earlier about bring some clarity to, what is the problem that this recommendation is solving. And, in Professor Dooling's response to that comment, one of the problems that I really heard was that there, may not be enough oversight, especially at senior levels of management of contractors. So this recommendation seems very salient and targeted at that problem. I was just going to suggest that there be some supplementation in the preamble, sort of outlining that problem and other problems that the contractors, our contractors and others on the committee see. But I really thought that this was a good recommendation that was targeted directly at an issue that I thought was important.
Thank you. Very helpful. Any other comments on 10? Comment 11. Consider ways to share information about contractors in rulemaking, both within and across agencies. Creating databases or schedules to create greater coordination. Hearing no comments or questions on that, then let's turn to 12. Any comments or questions on 12? Emily.
So this reads to me like a recommendation that agencies should always put on their website, sort of this information about contractors. And that seems to me to be inconsistent with the suggestion in the consultant's report for a more kind of case-by-case approach to this. And so it might be worth having a conversation about how much transparency and the circumstances in which we think transparency is sensible policy, because as I mentioned previously, I think I was pretty persuaded by the consultant's points that transparency can have more costs than benefits in certain circumstances. And I'll just share this one stray thought is, there's some discussion of comments from agencies where, upper level management basically said, I don't know what comes from a contractor and I don't care, I don't need to know. And I don't know that I agree with that sentiment, but it did raise an interesting question for me, which is, well, if the decision maker in the agency is getting an input and they don't know what came from a contractor and they don't care what came from a contractor and they're just using it as input, like, do I care? Should I care about what came from a contractor?
Good questions. Andrew.
I guess I'm probably picking up on the same point from Emily. I think that some of this, I'm thinking like, to what end? I mean, and the whole idea of, if the agency making a smart policy decision, everyone here has probably worked in agencies or other big organizations. You have some people who are particularly sharp and impressive and some who are not so much, and whether they're in the government or outside the government. And so, trying to flag things as, well, there's some level of certain contractors worked on this project. I'm just not sure to how that adds value. If the ideas and deliberation in the agency are very, robust and thoughtful and productive, and they come up with a good policy decision that the agency policymakers sign off on, that's great. And they should be trying to get as many ideas from as many people as possible. And that's, of course, what public comments is all about. And then to sort of suggest that it is done by a contractor, if anything, it just sort of invites, I think, potential criticism that might be inapplicable, because at the end of the day, the agency made the decision. And it's sort of even like the mention, and one of the things about the algorithms agencies use, that there's some, I always think I think it's more in the people's imagination than reality, but the algorithms that agencies use to decide what comments to review, I don't think that really exists anywhere. But it's sort of creating sort of these, feeding people with paranoia about things that are going on that just really aren't. And I'm not sure to what extent, showcasing what contractors are involved in things necessarily helps. And in some cases, the variety of how contractors work, since some of them are actually substantive experts who used to work in the agency coming back to offer help. In other cases, they're just temp firms offering temporary employees, or help almost placement firms where they're not even temporary, they're permanent employees, but they still work for the temp company. And there's a lot of different roles people play, and I'm just not sure how some of these things really, like what problem they're solving for, or how they're going to necessarily help solve the problem.
Okay, good. And I would certainly invite comments here on 12, 13, 14, and 15. And by the way, on any of these, one of the comments should be, this is not something we should go forward with. That's always a possibility, and we can certainly entertain those. Noelle, is this now the section that you were wanting to get to before? Great.
Yes, it is. Thank you. So I had a thought on 12 as well as 14. So regarding 12, the report I thought did a really great job. So with the caveat that I'm not a procurement attorney and all that stuff, I thought the report did a great job about kind of, identifying that there's sort of a blurred line between what is an inherently governmental function and what is like a closely related,
closely associated, I think.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Closely associated, function to an inherently governmental function. And from what I've learned, the inherently governmental function is, can't, be performed outside of the government, but the closely related thing can be. But the report also very clearly, talked about how that line is often very blurred. So I'm wondering with 12, if there might be, I don't know, like legal risk with specifying what tasks were assigned to contractors, to the extent that some of them, we might not know which bucket they fall into, because it sounds like, again, it's very gray in some instances. And so to the extent that we are listing something that a contractor does with respect to a rulemaking, and that happens to be something that is like illegal, like I'm just wondering if providing that information could also open up agencies to some legal risk. Maybe it's something that can be more segregated out, or I'm not sure, but just asking that for your consideration.
Certainly. I mean, some of these, there's exceptions for disclosure for deliberative processes, right? And so to the extent that what we're really getting at is trying to now sort of provide public notice about those deliberative processes, could that be problematic? Is that I think that's an important consideration, and I invite any conversation or comment on that. Thank you, Noelle. Elena? Noelle, did you have something on 14 as well?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So
I'm sorry, Elena. One more moment.
That's okay. No, but you just basically segued right into my concern with 14, which is, the extent that this might conflict with, or I don't know what the proper terminology is, but I guess the interactions that this recommendation may have with the deliberative process privilege, because I mean, my understanding is that for purposes of the deliberative process privilege, like in the FOIA context, for example, a contractor is considered like an arm of the agency, or there's some kind of like nuance there whereby an agency still has the ability, I mean, of course, depending on the particular circumstances, but generally likely has the ability to still claim that privilege over materials that it shares and exchanges with contractors. So like, just, the interaction, there might be some tension there between putting those materials in a docket and, protecting the DPP.
Although I would also say, though, that there's, in some ways, one could say that 14 might be a little bit superfluous if it's really materials like in this form of data or research upon which the agency's relying. then for judicial review purposes, that has to be there too, right? So yeah, I think you're right to call attention to how these things interact, not just with procurement, but also with rules of FOIA and other rules. So thank you. That's a very valuable point. I appreciate it. Elena now.
Yeah, I was gonna go back to the comment right before Noelle, although I think she touched on it a little bit as well. And, I'm paraphrasing, but the idea of like, senior leaders are saying, I don't know who was a contractor and worked on this, and I don't know that I really care. I think for me, some of what plays into that is I don't consider myself a senior leader first. But when I review something, like if anything a contractor worked on probably does come up through me as the project counsel assigned to a rulemaking. And if I review the document, I'm essentially, if I clear it, I'm saying I'm okay with everything that's in this document, or else I will have gotten my ducks in a row and sent an email saying all of the issues I had with the document. In case anything ever comes back. But, and I think everything goes through so many levels of review, and everyone is essentially doing the same thing, right? Like if once my boss reviews it, he's saying, yeah, I'm okay with what's here. And so by the time it gets up to the senior leaders, it's been essentially sort of adopted by and accepted by so many people below that it doesn't really matter who most of the individual people that worked on something were necessarily. And I would also say when I was previously in a supervisory role, like I took responsibility for what my staff did. So I reviewed it, and if they made a mistake, it was still on me because I should have caught it when I reviewed it. And so, I think that's sort of how I think about that. And I think some of that also plays into the deliberative process that Noelle was just mentioning.
Very helpful. Thank you. Rachel, you're next.
I just had a comment on number 14. I take the intent of 14 to be really about reports or discrete inputs that contractors are giving to agencies in rulemaking, and rather than a common analysis or things that might be deliberative, as Noelle suggested. And so I wondered if the language could be amended in 14 to say something like, if an agency relies upon reports or other discrete inputs to capture that nature, that it's not like if, again, regulatory drafting, like as our conversation has covered today, wouldn't be, we're not asking, I don't think, for red lines of what the contractor did versus the agency personnel. So if we could just make that a little clearer here.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody wants to respond to my hunch in a way that this is somewhat superfluous, because if there is a report or a discrete input or materials, however one wants to define it, on which the agency is relying for its decision in the rulemaking, then it needs to be part of the agency record, doesn't it, already? And is ACUS simply recommending something that agencies already have to do? And in the process, perhaps raising the kinds of questions that Noelle and Elena have indicated about whether this is broader than that. If it is superfluous, one always has to wonder, well, are they trying to do something else? And is it broader than that? So I don't know. I don't know if any of our other consultant wants to weigh in on that. Bridget.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think if this is elsewhere in the recommendations now. It may not be, but I think part of this was about saying, if you as an agency retain a contractor to write your entire economic analysis for your rule, it's a standalone document. The agency just wants to adopt that whole thing as their regulatory impact analysis, that it would make sense to mark that work product, was contractor generated. That we didn't see that happening, I don't think, and in what we saw. But another version of that, maybe less extreme, is where the contractor did a bunch of, say, economic or scientific analysis that then was just an input into the record for the agency, that a good best practice is to put that contractor report into the docket so, and then also, have the agency's analysis in the preamble where it would normally go. So that if you were so inclined, you could pull one up and do a side-by-side and say like, okay, how much of the contractor's work did the agency adopt here? And, where did they deviate? And you would understand like, okay, this is where that estimate came from. This is where that methodology came from. Or, here's where there's some daylight between the input and what the agency ended up doing. And that, particularly for those, standalone pieces where there really is, a separate document with some sort of analysis X, that a good best practice is to load that into the docket, even if the agency is otherwise, introducing that material in its own analysis in the preamble, that just sort of putting it all up there for the public would be a good step forward.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Stephanie?
I would just second Professor Dooling's sentiment and say that as an interagency reviewer of these types of documents, that's frequently something that I request and agencies agree to.
Yeah, and I would just add that there are agencies out there where that's their default, but it is not all of them. If you look through regulatory dockets, you'll see that it's not commonly done, but some agencies do it as a matter of routine. And so it's one of those forms of transparency for a particular type of information that doesn't seem overly onerous, doesn't seem to subject the agency to too much sort of downstream consequence for that disclosure. And so it struck us as something to include.
Okay, that's excellent. Are there any other comments on 12, 13, 14, or 15, any of these transparency paragraphs in the recommendation? Okay, let me ask a big picture question in the time we have remaining, and I guess it's already been raised to some extent by Emily and others, I think, during the conversation. Right now, we have 15 numbered paragraphs in the recommendation. Are there some that should be consolidated, moved to the preamble? Or is the committee generally comfortable with how this is laid out at present in terms of either the number of recommendations or the way they are arranged? One other suggestion that I had made was maybe moving the overarching stock-taking policy making at the start and then letting the others follow as almost factors or features that would be components of that written policy. Invite any comments on the overall structure of what we've walked through or the scope of what is contained in these 15 paragraphs. We come back in April then with something that looks, largely like this, we'll be ready to do finer tuning and move it forward. If that's where we go, let me know. Lon.
Right. Just overall, I think that the text ought to stand on its own. The reader ought to be able to simply look at the text and understand all the recommendations and whatever factors we put in there. I don't agree about, for instance, having the text there and having to refer back to the preamble to figure out what factors there are. So I think preamble should explain the text, but not contain information that isn't in the text itself.
Thank you, Lon, very much. Emily.
So I just want to reiterate, I think I've made a few suggestions for how I'd like the recommendation to be changed. And I don't want to suggest by my silence that I don't still think that. I think some of the stuff from the initial paragraphs could be moved up into the preamble. The general discussion of what agencies should take stock of should move up. And in general, I think I would like to see a recommendation that is more concise and focuses on a smaller number of important issues and gives more concrete recommendations as to those issues.
Okay, thanks, Emily. And, you know, we're not hearing anybody saying what should be left out other than perhaps moving 1 and 2 into the preamble. Is largely. Is that fair? Okay, Kevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to voice support for your suggestion of putting the sort of policymaking internal management up earlier and having the rest of the more specific recommendations follow. And I also wanted to voice some support for Emily's comment that she just made about a little bit more, fewer and more specific. Now that's easy to say and harder to do, but I definitely agree with the gist of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have any candidates for when you say fewer?
Yeah.
And we can come back to you if you want.
I guess in a way, while keeping, I was thinking on paragraph 8, we've been talking about, this is the one about internal management, each should have their own written policies, while allowing that they should have their own written policies because their practices are so diverse, whether we could do more work for the agencies. I was just thinking myself as an agency lawyer, receiving this paragraph 8 and wishing that ACUS had done a little more for me in how I might go about drafting this out. So maybe that's maybe this is going less towards less, but a little bit more towards more specifics. Now, I'd have to think more about exactly what I'd want, but that's the sort of general direction.
Okay. Jerry?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. I agree with your suggestions for reorganization, including moving things to the preamble and getting the drafting of policies up front. One other comment, which is that I find some ambiguity in some of the language that's used in the recommendations between recommending things to agencies in order that they not cross the line with respect to inherently governmental functions, and recommendations to agencies that they simply think through what they think in their particular context is an appropriate thing to be contracted out as against not, whether or not it crosses that line, which nobody knows how to define. It's suggesting to agencies that they ought to deal with the IGF as if that's a standard concept. It is a standard concept, just doesn't have much content. So if there was some way to tweak language so that it's clear that this covers more than just worries about inherently governmental functions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In inviting agencies to, in some sense, bracket that perhaps, and just say, what for rulemaking, what is our role for contractors? Would that be a fair summary? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Back to you, Emily.
I agree with Jerry, and I think we should consider a recommendation about whether and how agencies should use contractors in regulatory drafting in particular, in drafting rule texts and preambles. I mean, we've had, some of the responses were really informative for me, and it strikes me that there are things we could say about that subject, and I remain very troubled by the prospect that initial drafting would be done outside the agency. And it just seems very strange to me to adopt a recommendation on this subject that doesn't talk about that.
How should we talk about it? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think we need some, we seem, we seem to be very focused on whatever is in the recommendation. So I would like to have some recommendation that addresses this subject. And, the strongest possible version, which I'm not sure is the right one, is that agencies should retain primary responsibility for drafting rules and preambles and should not contract that out. If there are specific reasons why that's wrong, or certain circumstances in which it's appropriate, or ways in which drafting can be understood so that it is appropriate, then we should identify what those circumstances are.
Would it make sense to begin, or either in the preamble or maybe even the first recommendation, to articulate a principle here that the ultimate responsibility for the content of rules. Let's put, I might dodge the whole what counts as drafting question by just saying the ultimate responsibility for the content rests with the agency. I don't know if that would satisfy what you're getting at, Emily, but it would at least put front and center the broader principle or value that in some sense animates all of these other recommendations that follow. Just invite comment on that too. Kevin, you have your hand up. I don't know if that was a leftover from before. Okay. Dick, you're next then.
I just wanted to oppose Emily's suggestion. I think it's a terrible idea. I still think that's what we're doing. We're doing that today. It's just fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Now, your point about saying, well, it's the agency's ultimate responsibility. Well, that's true, but kind of. So, I mean, that's always going to be true.
It's nothing new, right?
It doesn't matter. And, eventually what comes out of all of this is going to go to a vote to 110 people. And it's the responsibility of that 110 person agency to be responsible for the final. But, whether it is an ACUS employee, for instance, or an ACUS contractor who does the initial draft, I think there can be circumstances in which an agency might want it one way and another agency might want it another way. So I do not think we're in a position. I actually think the way that the recommendations are phrased now is about right, given where we are. Basically what we're saying is think and publicize. Okay, I think that's as far as we can go and should go.
I would just add one further thought along those lines, Dick, that I don't think anybody has really raised yet, but when one looks at the authority that agencies tend to be granted, it's delegated to the agency head, right? So, it's even a question, I suppose, that one could ask, if it's somehow improper ultimately the ultimate responsibility is to the administrator, the secretary, whoever has that authority. It's a question of how do we get the work done leading up to what the secretary or administrator signs off on. Nick, you're next.
Thanks. I think Emily raises a really important question here, and I appreciate the conversation that question has prompted, including the responses from Andrew Emery and Elena earlier, that I think gave us an idea of how this power of the pen can operate in quite different ways. Now, I mean, as Carrie just said, it's principal agent relationships all the way down, from the statutorily responsible head of the agency to a bunch of different people, responsible to that person, whether they be employees of the agency or employees of a contractor. And I guess I can see how the significance of the employee contractor distinction could vary a lot and could sometimes be really significant and sometimes not be very significant in terms of telling us about what really matters, which is, is there, some kind of meaningful principal agent control over the ultimate policy choices. I can imagine situations, where the policy choice is meaningfully being made by the the responsible governmental officials, but the reduction to language, particularly if you're responding to a large number of highly technical comments or something like that, is something that we can leave to someone else. So I guess I see the need to discuss whether there ought to be a categorical distinction here, but from what I've seen so far, I think the variation in how significant the power of the pen is, the variation is great enough that I'm not sure we ought to be making a categorical distinction.
Thank you. Bridget, let's see. No, I have, yeah, Bridget, you're next. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sounds good. I'm really gratified by this discussion. This is, I think you're wrestling with the right issues that we wrestled with in writing the report. I guess just a couple reactions, hopefully with some color from the research. I mean, the line Carrie describes about articulating a principle that the ultimate responsibility for content rests with the agency, I would call that the status quo. So, it's sort of saying like, yep, the current policy is what it should be. Agencies are ultimately responsible. The line for what's an IGF is decision making. The line for something closely associated is everything leading up to the decision point, right? So it's all support. So I guess I just want to push a little to say, it's fine to ratify the status quo, but that doesn't actually move the ball in terms of what the agencies are struggling with in the day-to-day. We also heard from folks, we pushed on this question of drafting. We pushed a lot on that in our interviews because of the types of questions that you're very naturally coming to. Like drafting can be a lot of different things. So one thing I think we haven't quite put on the table today yet is this idea that the iterative nature of the rulemaking process itself, the writing heavy aspect of rulemaking itself, and the notion that the decision making, I remember one interview in particular, we said, so do you, the agency official, just sort of tell the contractor, or I think it came up this way, the interviewee said, we just tell the contractor like what they need to, like our policy decisions, and then we have them take the first draft at, writing the preamble. And it was like, okay, but, are all the decisions worked out in that first, direction to them? Oh, well, no, I mean, they come back and then we have to keep iterating, and they provoke some questions, or they'll say, do you mean this or that? And that we have to make all these sort of subsequent decisions as a result of that like iterative engagement. So I do think that muddies in a significant way the question of where discretion is, who's exercising it, and what tasks are happening in that type of drafting process. And so I appreciated that official conceding, like, well, no, right, we don't actually give them, a list of all the policy decisions that are going to be implicated in the rule. Those sort of come up over time, and we sort of work through it side by side with the contractor. And then I guess just one point on Dick raising the parallel to ACUS, which I think is actually a very fruitful one, particularly for the reasons that Emily raised to distinguish the two. And what I guess the only thing I would raise there is the point that the recommendations you're looking at did not come from us, right? So ACUS asked us to write some recommendations, but if you did a side-by-side on what's in the report and what's in front of you today, you'd see a whole lot of daylight, right? So I guess I just want to emphasize there was that interim staff step in the ACUS process, and this is consistent with how they do it in other places as well, not limited to our project, that the staff sort of takes the report and then boils it down into recommendations. There's plenty of areas where our recommendations as consultants diverge from what's in front of you. So that's just also a clarifying point that if you think what you're looking at is ours, like definitely it's not, it's staff work product.
And that's the general norm in ACUS too. Anyway, Bertrell,
yeah,
to you, we've got that's fine.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I know we got almost out of time, but just in response to the request for greater specificity and concreteness, and I generally am favorable to that recommendation, but I do worry here about getting too far ahead of the research. The research that was done is quite important and valuable, but it's still, kind of a starting point to understanding the role of contractors in agencies, and it involves, a set of qualitative interviews, which are again quite valuable. But we still don't have kind of the global map of how these things, how contractors are working in agencies, how this whole process is working. And so I worry about specificity that does not accord with, it isn't derived from the findings from the research. And so I just want us to be tethered to what the consultants so helpfully found.
Right. And one of the things they found very clearly is variation and recommendations that really direct and encourage agencies to develop their own policies and answers to these questions is consistent with that finding, at least, I think, or at least it follows and is taking that into account. Jerry, I think you'll have the last word here from the committee. I will invite Matt Weiner if he has any closing comments here in a minute, but go ahead, Jerry.
Thanks, Jerry. Just a suggestion about a straddle between Emily's point and Nick's point. We might, in the preamble, where we talk about the advantages and the risks of contracting out, at least flag as a potential risk the first mover advantage with respect to contracting out things like drafting the text of recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Excellent suggestion. And I think seeing a more fleshed out version of the preamble will be helpful at our next meeting, which will be on, I believe it's April 12th. You'll get emails about that. This conversation today has been enormously valuable, I think, and helpful in creating that. We'll be creating that first draft of the preamble. I take it, and obviously it'll be up to the committee to take a look at what the next iteration of these recommendations will look like. But I take it that there's some support for a little bit of rearranging, at least, and in addition to fleshing out the preamble along the lines that Jerry's suggesting and others have suggested as well. With that, let me see if Matt, if you have any closing comments that you want to offer us, if you're still here.
I do not see him on here.
I don't see him here. Okay, well then we are at the end of our time. I want to thank all of the committee members, all of the public members, and the participating members from the public too, who have contributed to this conversation, for sharing your helpful insights. I think it's been a very productive, I know probably also very long, meeting, but I think it's been very productive. We are looking at something that, to pick up on Bertrell's last point, is one that we've got a real new window on with the consultant's report, but that window still is a little blurry, to be sure. So we do want to be mindful of that. Thank you all. We will hope to see you then on April 12th at our next meeting. The meeting that we've just had now is concluded, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.